Hi everyone, it's so great to be with you. I am devastated that I can't be there in person this year, and I'm really hoping to see many of you next year in Perth at the DSF conference, but we'll have to make do with an online presentation today. I'm going to be talking to you about designing, implementing and evaluating the response to intervention framework in literacy. I'm just going to focus on literacy today because we do know that about 80% of students who struggle or who might have a learning difficulty or a learning disability, the difficulty that they experience is in that domain of literacy. So the majority of learning difficulties and disabilities that students experience during the school years tend to be in that literacy domain. Okay, so what is the response to intervention framework? Response to intervention is, I like this quote, a practice of providing high quality instruction and interventions matched to student need, monitoring progress frequently to make decisions about changes in instructional goals, and applying that student response data to important educational decisions. So as I work through it today, I want you to really think about this as a way of providing high quality instruction and intervention. So even though the name is response to intervention, we don't want to just be thinking about extra or add-ons. We want to be thinking about the quality of the instruction that we're providing to all students. So the primary goal is improved outcomes for all of our students, regardless of their ability levels. And the secondary goal is to provide data to identify learning difficulties in a timely manner. So we're wanting to pick up early the students who are struggling. So it's a research-based or evidence-informed instructional framework, and it replaced what used to be called the IQ performance or cognitive discrepancy model. Now that model was in place quite a while ago now, really that we waited to see how students performed, and then they may have had a cognitive assessment, and then there was a comparison made between their IQ or their cognitive performance on assessment and how they were doing in the classroom. So we've moved away from that model, thankfully, which really had a bit more of a kind of wait to fail approach. Now, just as you get used to me talking about the response to intervention or RTI framework, you should know that it's now been replaced with the term multi-tiered system of supports. That's just a more broader, all-encompassing support system that's designed to target all aspects of academic and behaviour difficulty. I'm calling it RTI today because I think that's probably what you're most familiar with. That's probably the term that you've heard before. And most of the research literature and books that have been written about this are still called RTI. The MTSS term has not necessarily flowed through yet. Hughes and Dexter in their research review talk about the RTI framework as progressively intense instruction. And I really like that idea of thinking about how can we intensify or increase the amount of instruction based on student need for that. The idea that we're not doing something different or other for students who struggle, who might need additional instructional support. They don't go to a different program. We're going to provide them with progressively intense instruction in the areas that they're struggling with in the classroom. Okay, so it's a three-tiered model, and here are the three tiers. So tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Often you'll see the pyramid or the triangle around the other way. I like to do it this way. So we see tier 1 first at the top and everything else flows through from that. So the idea is tier 1, whole class, there's core instruction. We have universal screening, or think about that, say, benchmarking 3 times a year. Progress monitoring, so additional assessment, more frequent assessment for the students who are struggling, so they're behind their peers, as identified through universal screening. And we have differentiation. Now, I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide, but the idea is differentiation of support rather than task. So their students are getting, if they're struggling, additional support to complete the same tasks as their peers. So according to the research literature, tier 1, so quality, and quality is the key term there, quality core instruction should be sufficient for somewhere between 70 to 90% of students. Some other research studies say tier 1 is 85%, tier 2 is 15%, and tier 3 is 5%, so 85, 15, 5. But it does vary a little bit, so I just wanted to show that variation in these tiers. Tier 2 instruction is supplemental instruction, so it's in addition to tier 1 whole class core instruction. It's done in small groups, and there's more frequent progress monitoring, so ideally every 3 to 5 weeks in the particular areas that have been that are being targeted with that additional instruction. And again, there's variability in the numbers, but around somewhere between 10% and 25% of students will need this additional top-up instruction. And then tier 3 is intensive intervention. So most of the time, it might be very, very small group, but most of the time it's an individualized program. So it's designed specifically around the needs of one student. And even more frequent progress monitoring. So we might be reviewing student progress every 1 or 2 weeks. Some research studies even recommend doing it multiple times within 1 week. I haven't had experience with that kind of structure myself. It's more like every 1 to 2 weeks. And somewhere between this range, 2 to 10% of students will need this intensive intervention. So typically the students with needing tier 2 support are the students who are behind, but there's no pervasive, persistent reason why that should be the case. And with additional support and instruction, the idea is that they catch up and they join their peers in tier 1. The students who require tier 3 support are more likely to be those students with persistent difficulties and more likely to receive a formal diagnosis of a learning disability rather than just a learning difficulty, which is the tier 2. Okay, so let's break down the 3 tiers a little bit more. So tier 1 is whole class best practice instruction. So on the previous slide, I said quality instruction. I said quality is important. On this slide, I'm going to say whole class best practice instruction. Best practice instruction is the really important part here. And we think about this as primary prevention or proactive instruction. The primary prevention term, and you'll see some other prevention terms come through as I go through this slide, they come from public health. So the idea is, what do we do for the majority to do best by them and to prevent them having problems down the track? So whole class best practice instruction, we've got high quality curriculum and evidence-informed instructional methods for all students. So high quality curriculum, evidence-informed instruction, they're the non-negotiables there. Differentiation of support, not tasks, like I alluded to on the previous slide. So we're not giving struggling students other different work to go on with. We're not going to give them easy or more simplified tasks unless accommodations are indicated. We're going to up the ante in terms of the amount of support or scaffolding that we provide them within which to succeed. Now, this next point is important. The overwhelming majority should succeed. We have high expectations for all students. For most students, in some cases, up to 90% of students can succeed with high quality tier 1 instruction. So we should be expecting that. And if we're not getting that, we have to be prepared to examine our tier 1 instruction. Tier 2 small group additional instruction, and we call this secondary prevention, which is that second tier of public health intervention or support. So the recommendations are usually between 3 and 5 students per group, and the groups are intended to be homogeneous. Now, homogeneous means it's not talking about student ability per se, it's talking about the skills that are being targeted. So for example, I might have a student in grade 1 and I might have a student in grade 2 or grade 3 that they may not have mastered adjacent consonants or consonant clusters at the start and the end of words. So what they need or the skill they need to develop is the same. Therefore, I will group those students together, right? So we're not just looking at ability overall or number of questions correct on a particular assessment. We're trying to group students based on skill so we can give highly targeted instruction based on the skill that we're trying to build or the knowledge we're trying to build. 3 30-minute sessions per week, or you can see in brackets the range there. So the recommendation based on the research evidence as to what can be the most effective, 20 to 40, 3 to 5 minutes, 3 to 5 times per week. So it's quite a lot It takes a lot of resources and time to deliver the type of support that is actually required. And the idea, and this is described in most of the literature, is that it's an increased dose of tier 1 instruction, not something else. And I've seen that in a range of schools and a range of contexts where what's happening in tier 1 is not necessarily optimal. And students might, so say it may not be a more structured, explicit approach to teaching literacy, but tier 2, they'll go on and do a structured systematic phonics program. Now that's not going to have much effect because technically they're only getting what they actually needed in the first place, perhaps 3 times a week. So the idea is best practice tier 1 instruction. There will be students for whom that's insufficient, so we up the dose, we give them more. We support that transfer from working memory to long-term memory better through increased dose. And it's time limited, so we set goals around time. So after 10 weeks, this is where I expect my students to be, and this is my plan to get them there. So time limited, 10 to 20 weeks, not just leaving it open-ended. And the expectation is within 10 or 20 weeks that the students should catch up to their peers. And tier 3 specialist support, or in the public health and the medical literature, it's called tertiary prevention. So this is the pointiest end of care or support or instruction. 1 to 3 students per group. More often than not, this is just one-on-one support, but very small groups can be effective. Increased frequency, this is what the literature tells us that these students actually need. I don't know how many students actually receive this in our education system, but 45 to 60 minutes daily in order to make gains. Highly individualized, highly targeted. So rather than it just being an additional dose of tier 1 instruction, more often than not, we need to think more specifically about this individual student's needs. So it may not be sufficient just to provide an increased dose. It might be that we need to do something different as well. And it's extended duration. So these students may be receiving intervention, for example, for a full academic year. The intensity, as we move from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3, we increase the intensity of support or instruction in a few ways. So using more teacher-led systematic and explicit instruction. So students are receiving more instruction. We're conducting that instruction more frequently. We're adding to its duration. We're creating smaller, more homogenous groups. Now, remember I said homogenous in terms of the skill or the particular thing that they need. And we're relying on educators with greater expertise. So the idea is we move through the tiers, we increase the expertise or the level of training or skill that the practitioners may have. And again, that flies in the face of what often happens in schools, where as the needs increase, whether they're academic or behavioural, we tend to decrease the amount of expertise that the person providing the support has. So it's really important. Tier 2 intervention can be provided by well-trained volunteers, can be provided by well-trained education support staff. I'm not sure the terminology you use in Western Australia, but formerly called Integration Aids in Victoria, we now call them education support staff members. But well-trained is the key part of that, right? So we need to make sure there's formal professional learning and ongoing support. And tier 3 is usually an expert in that field. So we're thinking special educators, we're thinking perhaps an educational psychologist, a speech pathologist, someone who's had extensive training and experience in that domain. Okay, so why use the response to intervention framework? Let me try and convince you. Students will struggle for many reasons. It's inevitable that some students will struggle. So they may have experienced socioeconomic disadvantage. They may have had home environments where there hasn't been a lot of language or pre-literacy exposure. They may have language difficulties due to learning English as an additional language. They might have developmental language disorder, all sorts of social, emotional, behavioural difficulties, medical and health issues can get in the way of making progress. And the other one that we're really concerned about is inadequate instruction. So less than optimal tier 1 whole class instruction. So the response to intervention framework is the best framework to use if you want to be a school that is research informed, a school that identifies struggling students early. So we're not waiting to fail. We're not waiting to see how students go and then go, oh, far out, we've got, 25% of our year one students are behind where they should be. If you want to be a school that develops high quality assessment, instruction and intervention practices school-wide, and school-wide is the important part there. It's not just little bits and pieces of intervention here and there. It's a whole school approach. A school that develops data literacy in all staff, and a school that's data-driven. So it's the best framework we currently have available to us. So it's now been changed to MTSS, multi-tiered system of supports, but it's the most validated in terms of the research. It's the best framework that we have available to us at this current point in time. So what's the evidence for the response to intervention framework? Positively, there's some really good evidence to support the use of universal screening, which is that essential assessment process in Tier 1. There's really good evidence to support the use of progress monitoring, so more frequent assessment for struggling students, whether they're struggling in Tier 1, Tier 2 or Tier 3. There's really good evidence to support the use of explicit and systematic instruction in reading and writing, and I won't need to convince you of that point. And there's good evidence to support the use of evidence-informed core curricula and programs, so high quality curriculum or high quality programs that are informed by the research. But, and this is often where we see things go wrong, there's good evidence for all of the individual components for the response to intervention framework, but sometimes when we put it all together, we don't see consistently strong evidence for the model itself or for model scalability in schools. Or across schools, so say, for example, a network of schools. Now, why is that? Lots of issues arise. There might be inadequate professional learning and training for staff at Tier 1, Tier 2 or Tier 3. Often what's a reason for things falling apart is there's not enough administrative support, or there's not a person to lead it or coordinate the response to intervention framework. Schools tend to fail to allocate enough time for meetings, for planning, for reviewing progress, staffing or resourcing, having enough people to actually run the intervention and lead the response to intervention framework, getting staff buy-in. There can be issues around the assessments that are used, the frequency of assessments. So while all the moving parts have really good evidence, putting it together and actually rolling it out in the school, there's lots of reasons why it fails or it's not as effective as it could be. But the good news is that response to intervention studies to date, and there are quite a few of them now, do demonstrate that achievement or performance improve through use of the response to intervention framework. So the amount of progress that students or groups of students make or year levels make varies from study to study, but all of the RTI studies today do show improved performance, which is great news. But the literature does point out all of those issues that I was just discussing. Studies, or historically anyway, have tended to focus on early reading and math skills, but I've said perhaps that's changing. So what we're missing in the literature is really looking RTI studies that look at higher order skills. So thinking about moving on to looking at reading comprehension or compositional writing. And most of the studies have tended to focus on really early aspects of knowledge or skill development. So we don't have a lot, compared to the early years, we don't have a lot for, say, upper primary school, and it's even less so in secondary school. But there is some research coming out now looking at the multi-tiered system of support in secondary school settings, which is really great to see. Overall, if we think about all of these factors and all of these reasons why the RTI model sometimes is not as effective as it could be in schools, we can say that we have emerging evidence for a range of RTI models. We do need more research on how to be most effective in developing and sustaining RTI in schools. So there's no issues with the moving parts. The issues emerge when we put everything together and try and roll things out in the school setting. Rush through that ending of that slide. I thought I had another point coming. Okay, so in my view, and I didn't just make this up, it's really based on, the readings that I've done and the research that I've reviewed, but there are three key areas, I think, when we're trying to roll things out in the school, three key areas to get right. Assessment, what we assess, when we assess, how we use assessment data. Our curriculum, so what's the quality of our curriculum materials? How well mapped is our curriculum? Do we know what we're teaching and when? What are the materials and resources we're going to use? And then instruction. So within that, it's not just, do we use, say, explicit direct instruction? It's also how well have we trained our practitioners, whether they're teachers in Tier 1, education support staff in Tier 2. How well have we supported our educators to develop really excellent, high quality instruction? So 3 really big areas where there's lots to do in each of those spaces. So I'm going to try and unpack those in basically the rest of the presentation. So we need to select and administer assessments. We want to select our assessment tasks that do a few things. So we want them to yield meaningful data. So the assessment needs to match the instruction. The instruction ideally is all aligned with the assessment. Now that does not mean teaching to the test, it just means that we're assessing in ways that we're actually capturing what it is that we teach. Reflect the knowledge and skills that we're going to be teaching, tied to expectations for learning, are technically adequate. So we want good quality measures. And we want to ensure that teachers are trained to administer correctly and consistently. The wheels can really fall off there. That we provide scripted instructions, or at least highly scaffolded step-by-step instructions. Many of the assessments in the literacy space are scripted. Observation and coaching occurring during initial administration and scoring, and some of the key RTI recommendations stipulate this, and cross-checking a percentage of assessments for scoring reliability. So I think a few of these steps might happen in schools, but I think many of them get overlooked when we're thinking about a high quality RTI framework. In my school setting, we have our benchmarking using the DIBELS assessment 3 times a year. We have the universal screening in Year 1 with the phonics check, additional progress monitoring for students who struggle. So it's every 2 to 3 weeks for students who get intensive, so Tier 3 equivalent support, and every 3 to 5 weeks for students receiving strategic support in Tier 1 or 2. We prioritise language and reading in the early years, so the core reading skills. We continue to monitor through primary school, but it changes a little bit in terms of how we monitor it. And we have formative assessment and frequent checking for understanding is the expectation in all classes. And valuing the role of review as well, so continuing to revisit learning. The other thing that we've focused on is professional learning on assessment administration, interpreting data and goal setting, and we've had a number of sessions this year that have focused on that. So what is the assessment? How do we do it? Why are we doing it? What do we get from it? Afterward, looking at the data, having meetings as teams or year levels or a whole staff to go, okay, let's interpret it. How do we set goals? What's going on here? What are the patterns? And that's really important. That's part of the culture. So this is what our whole school assessment schedule looks like. So we've got DIBELS, and you can see all the subtests there. So that's done across F to 6, although the subtests within that vary across the year levels. So we do that 3 times a year, March, June, and October. Cubed, which is the oral language listening comprehension assessment, is done in F to 2 3 times a year. The motif spelling assessment, so DIST S, DIST N, and DIST I, so spelling of sounds, spelling of non-words, and spelling of irregular words, is done once a year in F to 2, and the components of spelling tests looking at phonology, orthography, and morphology is done in 3 to 6 once a year. Providing comparative judgment and writing moderation. So comparative judgment happens twice a year, writing moderations twice a year. So we're part of the No More Marking comparative judgment pilot, but we're hopeful that we can move to a whole school comparative judgment process into the future. PAT reading comprehension, that's just the assessment that's done in our network of schools. So we're really strongly encouraged to use that assessment to monitor reading comprehensions. That's done once a year. We have the phonics screening check, like I said before, in Year 1, and we use the PAT grammar and punctuation in 3 to 6 once a year. So those are all the data points that we use to support students in Tier 1, Tier 2. Predominantly, we're using the DIBELS data to set goals for intervention and to modify instruction. We also have NAPLAN, obviously, and we have the mandatory English online interview in the first year of school in Victoria. So after we've assessed, we have to evaluate the screening data. So this is a table that I originally saw in a book that I'll show you the reference at the end of the presentation, but we have to evaluate the screening data. Now, the first point is there a grade-wide problem? So how we answer that is, do more than 50% of students, do more than 50% of classes have a class-wide problem? So a class-wide problem basically means in an individual class are 30, 40, 50+% of students struggling. So a grade-wide problem means that's happening in 50% of classes. So if that is the case, yes, we have some decisions to make. If we don't really know what's going on or why it's going on, we'll go down the left-hand side. So if 50% of classes have an unknown problem, we have to kind of dig deeper to kind of examine what on earth's going on here. And then once we figure it out, we can implement and evaluate the solution. But if the answer is we kind of know the problem. So for example, our foundation students might be missing a bunch of code knowledge, or they've not mastered something, but then we go, you know what, we spent 3 months of the year in remote learning. We weren't able to check for understanding quite as well. Let's go back to those units that we covered. And as a whole class, we're going to give them supplemental instruction with that. We'll implement that. We'll go down, rule out students with adequate response to intervention. We'll go down again, identify students at risk and provide intervention and evaluate responses. So that's that flow chart. I'll unpack in the next couple of slides what that means. If there's not a grade-wide problem, so that means that less than 50% of classes in that grade are demonstrating through the data that students are really struggling, we can go down and identify students at risk and provide intervention. Now, there's a few layers to this. So just because it's not a grade-wide problem, there still could be classes with students, individual classes with students who are struggling way more than they should be, right? So we say, okay, prep doesn't have a grade-wide problem, but 2 of the 6 prep classes, there's something going on there. So the solutions here are either support to improve tier 1 instruction if there's a class-wide problem. So remember, 30, 40, 50+% of students are struggling. We've got to fix tier 1. Something's not right with the tier 1 instruction. It might be that just there's a significant portion in a particular class, perhaps they've come to the school, started school in prep, and they have not spoken very much English coming into school, and they might be picking things up a little bit slower. They just need more intense tier 1 instruction. So it might be supplemental tier instruction, that might be the solution. So something on top of what's already happening to speed up the learning process for those students. Or it might be that we've just got 5 students out of 22 in that particular class who are struggling, and tier 1 instruction is great. So we're going to think about tier 2 instruction for those students. So a few decisions and conversations that need to be made at that point. And then again, we go down, remove students with adequate response to intervention. We identify students at risk and provide intervention and evaluate response. So those are the decisions we need to make and at leadership level, at team leader level, etc., to figure out what's going on. Is it grade-wide? Is it class-wide? And then look within classes. So identify patterns in the data. If there's class-wide learning problems detected, then the grade level team should examine grade-wide data to determine whether grade-wide problem is apparent. So this is talking to the steps that I talked you through on the previous slide. If the screening tasks were appropriate and administered correctly, always check that first. Then we need to ask, is a research-based, or a better way of phrasing that would have been evidence-informed, core curriculum in place? Yes or no? Is that curriculum, if it's in place, being followed with sufficient instructional time or with effective techniques? Yes or no? Is there a scope and sequence detailing when skills will be targeted or mastered across each year level? Yes or no? If no, make one. If yes, is it being followed? Have students mastered the prerequisite skills? If not, we might need to go back and teach that. Is the instructional environment, that's a typo there, one in which students are actively engaged, non-instructional time is kept to a minimum, and most students are responding accurately? Are students receiving corrective feedback? Is a grade-wide problem isolated to one grade, or is it pervasive? So is it just the year ones that seem to be really struggling this year, or are we seeing this pattern kind of across grade 1, grade 2, into grade 3? What's going on? And are there shared features between classes with class-wide learning problems? So is it something like veteran versus graduate teacher, or, you know, only lower or higher grades with grade-wide problems? Can we find any patterns here? So quite a series of steps that we can work through in teams and to have these really rich discussions to figure out what's going on. If class-wide, so we're looking grade-wide before and digging deeper, if class-wide learning problems are detected that are located to a particular class, and if the screening tasks were appropriate and administered correctly, again, check that first, then we need to ask a few questions. Is the teacher adhering to the curriculum? Is the teacher adhering to the scope and sequence? Is the teacher allowing sufficient instructional minutes? Did students in the class master the prerequisite skills? Are there common features among low-performing students in the class? And lastly, maybe most importantly, is the instructional environment one in which students are actively engaged, non-instructional times kept to a minimum, and most students are responding accurately? If students make mistakes, are they receiving that feedback? So again, there's quite a few questions there that we can work through at the class level. So on the previous side, we're working through grade level. Now we can look at digging deeper within a particular classroom. Okay, so then we want to plan our solutions. So core solutions depend on the answers that we come up with to our grade-wide and class-wide questions on the previous two slides. So what are we going to do big picture? Class-wide and grade-wide problems will suggest that more frequent monitoring is required. So what are we going to do between benchmarks to check whether or not what we're doing is having an effect? I like to say that the problem drives the solution. So if students are collectively struggling with, say, phone-in segmentation, then the solution is obviously to increase the amount of instruction and the amount of feedback in that area. But if we have a different problem, like a teacher's just actually not teaching the phonics curriculum, for example, or only allocating half of the time required to the phonics curriculum, that's obviously going to have a very different approach. So we need to know the problem to drive the solution. We can't just trial solutions and expect that to be effective if we don't know the problem. So common solutions are usually research-informed curriculum. Do we have higher quality curriculum? Do we have detailed scope and sequences that map what needs to be taught and when it needs to be taught? Do we have highly effective and across-class consistency with teaching techniques? Do we have really high quality practices? Have we invested in high quality professional learning in the target areas? So it might be a particular teacher struggling because they're one of 6 teachers who actually hasn't had formal training in that particular phonics approach. And ongoing targeted implementation and support and coaching cycles. And that's really important if we want to have that culture of practice improvement and to really support people to change their practice. Okay, so supplemental solutions, so the add-on solutions. After we've established and delivered this evidence-based, evidence-informed core curriculum, what we need to do is identify the students below benchmark, right? So we're going to group students by area of need, or the skills that they're going to be working on, the knowledge they're going to be building. So those homogenous groups that I talked about. Plan and provide intervention at tier 1 and 2. So within the whole class and then on top of as required. We're going to embed regular progress monitoring. So every 2 to 5 weeks in tier 1 and 2, every 1 to 2 weeks in tier 3. There's a bit of variation in the literature around the frequency of this. Review intervention if students don't make progress on 4 consecutive progress monitoring measures. So if they're not making progress on 4 consistent measures, we have to go, what's going on in an intervention? Do they need to up the dose? Do we need to change what we're doing? Are we not being as effective as we could be in terms of how we're structuring these sessions? The intervention requires a full review at that point. Just to note, their class-wide interventions should be a supplement to core instruction. So say there's a class-wide problem and we say, okay, to fix this class-wide problem, we need to do X, Y, and Z. That's in addition to the core high-quality instruction. So we're kind of having to carve out some time to do top-up or supplemental instruction on top of that. So we don't want to stop doing what we know we need to be doing. We need to be thinking about how we can add on to that. So we don't want to interfere with our high quality core instruction. Preserve that time. Evidence-informed curriculum and instruction. So this is a brilliant quote. Evidence-based Tier 1 instruction effectively eliminates inappropriate instruction as a reason for inadequate progress. And how great is that to have that in place in your school, to know that the students who are really struggling because they're really struggling, right? It's not a problem with the instruction. It's not a problem with the curriculum. These students really do need additional support. Let's give it to them. So here's the checklist. Are all components of effective reading instruction present and prominent? Are all components of effective writing instruction present and prominent? Are all components of effective instruction generally present and prominent? So do we have explicit and systematic instruction? Is the curriculum aligned, coordinated, cumulative, mapped, sequential? And the three important features of any core literacy program are the following: based on or informed by research, explicit instructional strategies, and consistent organisational and instructional routines. So three key things to focus on. Our core programs, high quality, evidence informed. We teach explicitly, we've got good instructional techniques, and we have predictable routines. So in my school setting, our core curriculum for word level reading and spelling, we use the Sounds Right program in F2, and we use spelling mastery in 3 to 6. So they get 25 minutes of spelling mastery or 30 minutes of Sounds Right per day. Reading fluency, anywhere between 10 and 15 minutes of daily practice. Handwriting, 10 to 15 minutes explicit practice each day. We use the core knowledge curriculum, English, history, geography and science, either knowledge or text units. On top of the core knowledge curriculum, we also have text units. Some are from Reading Reconsidered, that English curriculum, some we've created ourselves. So they have explicit reading, vocab and writing instruction embedded. So they get 5 hours of English per week and 5 hours combined of history, geography and science per week. On top of that, they're getting their core literacy skills block that we do first thing in the morning, which is when we do phonics, handwriting and reading fluency. So all in all, they're getting something like just over 13 hours per week in either content, knowledge or skills. Grammar and punctuation are taught in the context of writing instruction, and we follow the Writing Revolution scope and sequence and pacing guides. We do use a lot of the Writing Matters work by William Van Cleve as well. So a few different things into our writing instruction, and then very detailed reading, writing scope and sequences. So it makes it very clear what students should develop mastery in each term, each semester, each year. What are we teaching and when we're teaching it? So for core instruction, we have an EDI model, most prominent in literacy and numeracy, but the EDI model across the school. Consistent slide decks and slide structure to support consistent instruction. We have weekly professional learning as a whole staff. We offer and provide formal training in programs that we use. So Sounds Right and the Writing Revolution. Oh yeah, I'll talk about evaluation in a minute of that. Okay, so evaluation, how are we going? Is it working? What are we doing right? What needs to be tweaked? So we review benchmark data 3 times a year after we benchmark. Review progress monitoring data every 2 to 5 weeks. We have leadership meetings at the end of each term to evaluate the data, to determine progress, to look for problems with progress, and to move students in and out of intervention. So we have 10-week tier 2 interventions. Now, it's not to say once you've done the 10 weeks, you're not going to get another 10 weeks if you need it, but we put a time limit of 10 weeks. So you get that one term and we'll see how you go. Formal observation and instructional coaching program. So this is at tier 1 and tier 2. So also observation and coaching of the interventionists. So they get observed, they get feedback, they have lesson modelling offered to them if that's their preference for practice improvement as well. That happens at tier 1 and tier 2 to ensure that we're getting consistent high quality practice. And then we have learning walks twice per term. So that's leadership and any teachers who are interested in being part of that process. So twice per term, we walk through the whole school and we pick a particular focus. It might be literacy, it might be numeracy, it might be knowledge, it might be writing instruction. And we observe and provide whole staff feedback and set goals for the next cycle. something that you might come across if you're reading books on this or reading the literature are these terms problem solving versus standard protocol. It sounds very technical and you probably don't need to know this, but I just wanted to put this in here in case you do follow up with any of the readings that I'm going to show you. The difference in this terminology only relates to what schools do at tier 2 of the RTI framework. So nothing else is different about assessment, nothing's different about tier 1, nothing's different about tier 3. It just relates to potential differences that you might see or you might choose to enact at tier 2. So we've got problem solving and standard protocol, two different approaches. Schools tend to favour the problem solving approach, and then researchers tend to favour a standard protocol approach, just because with standard protocol, you're able to ensure more accuracy and more consistency. Our school model is probably a bit of a hybrid. It's something in between. So problem solving means that there's collective brainstorming as a team, a leadership team, to decide on intervention goals. So the team makes instructional decisions based on individual student needs. Students who struggle get a variety of interventions based on need or performance data. So a variety of interventions is a key thing to think about here as a difference. And interventions are tailored to individual or specific needs. That's a key difference to think about. So there's collective brainstorming. Okay, this is what we've got. Okay, what will we do? This is what we'll do. So as opposed to standard protocol, where standard equals consistent or the same for all students, and protocol just means pre-selected. So pre-selected, consistent, same intervention for all students. The interventionist or the leader of the program makes instructional decisions that follow the standard protocol. So there's a single consistent intervention used, pre-selected and evidence-informed, and a variety of staff. That's an added bonus, is a variety of staff can deliver the intervention if they're well-trained and supported to do so. So we meet to do collective brainstorming and do talk about things, and we do consider individual needs, obviously, in individual data, but we follow more of a standard protocol process in that we have preset interventions. So we say these are the interventions that we're offering. Basically, what we need to determine for the group of students is this, just the start point with that particular standard or that particular approach. Okay. Just a slide on post-primary considerations, as in what do we do after primary school, to be aware of. So there's less evidence. It's not to say that theoretically RTI can't be as effective in secondary settings. We just don't have as much evidence in secondary settings. Like I said earlier, research tends to focus on the earlier years. Universal screening, or as I like to put it, sound assessment practices are less common once students are in high school. In secondary settings, there's less of a focus on identifying problems, in my experience, that it's more about, well, this is where students are at this point in time. There's not a lot of digging around to identify reading difficulties or disabilities or writing difficulties or disabilities. The most important part to think about, if you're thinking about an RTI framework in secondary, is the focus is now on remediation rather than prevention. So in the primary setting, we've got that proactive preventative instruction in tier 1. In secondary, we can assume that that ship sailed and now we need to focus on remediation, so catching students up. So what that means is we can actually move students directly into tier 2 or tier 3 intervention based on assessment data. So we don't need to test out a response to intervention. We're not doing that in that way that we would do in primary school with tier 1, playing around with tier 1. We just go, okay, assessment data, is small group intervention going to be sufficient at tier 2, or do they need more targeted tier 3 intervention? So it's almost like we skip that step. Just the last few slides, I want to talk about staffing and resources. So what can it look like? In 2021, now I should note here that in my school, we're a brand new school. So we only opened in January, February of this year. So it's been a real trial and error this year. We were clear from the start that we wanted to have high quality, best practice tier 1 and tier 2 intervention. So tier 1 instruction and tier 2 intervention, but we've been playing around with kind of what works best to try and decide on what our model looks like. We've also had lots of interruptions this year with various lockdowns, but this is what we did this year. So We had a leadership team that was meeting once or twice a term. So principal, assistant principal, English leader, that's me. And we have a year one leader who's our intervention coordinator. She's a dual qualified teacher speech pathologist. English leader, so I was overseeing assessment, curriculum, instruction, intervention, professional learning and practice development. So driving that at all tiers. We had a teacher employed as an interventionist and they had formal training and professional learning. And we also had final year Master of Speech Pathology students helping out with some intervention cycles as well. So we're really fortunate to have them this year. And if you remember the slide before, standard protocol, these were the interventions. So Sounds Right was the intervention for word level reading and spelling. And we had Story Champs, which was an intervention for oral language. In the early years, we've got more than 60% of students in our setting that come to us with very little English, so they're learning English as an additional language. So we were doing some work with at the whole class tier 1 level, but trying out what some supports could look like at tier 2 level as required as well. But we've learned quite a few lessons this year and have a clear idea about what next year and beyond will look like. So this is the plan for tier 2 support in 2022. I should say that we're not running a full tier 3 intervention program at the moment. It's a really low number of students, I'd say, across our school at the moment. Probably, it's definitely less than 10. I was going to say less than 5 students, but I don't want to say that in case I'm wrong. But it's a low number and a number of those students are accessing already external support. But that's something that we do want to look at fleshing out, but I'll just talk about tier 2. So tier 2 interventions from next year, we've got Sounds Right, that will continue. Spelling through morphographs, spelling mastery for middle and upper primary, oral reading fluency intervention on top of whole class, corrective reading comprehension, expressive writing and writing revolution techniques. Now, put an asterisk beside corrective reading and beside expressive writing, because that would be in addition to classroom practice. So I'm still trying to figure out the detail about how I can best align tier 1 and tier 2 instruction there, because we're wanting to have tier 2 as an additional dose. So if we're using a program that's not necessarily uniformly being done in tier 1, I want to figure out how I close those gaps as well as I can. Staffing, so we've got our leadership team, English leader, education support staff trained, so 20 intervention hours per week, so across 2 people. And speech pathologist as the intervention coordinator, 1 to 2 days per week is the plan. So the key takeaways, I know it's been a whirlwind tour of the response to intervention framework. I hope it's been useful. The key takeaways from my perspective, getting core instruction, so tier 1 instruction right, is our most important work. And this can reduce the number of students at risk by up to 25%. So there's good research evidence that shows using the RTI framework, really focusing on getting tier 1 instruction right, can prevent something like 20% or 25% of students needing that additional tier 2 support. So it makes sense from a resourcing perspective, as well as it just being the right thing to do. We develop an evidence-informed assessment schedule alongside this work, so alongside getting tier 1 instruction right. We see how students respond to high quality tier 1, then identify students for tier 2 support, but tier 1 instruction is the first step. If too many students continue to struggle in tier 1, we have to review and refine tier 1, either at a grade level or at a class level. We must invest heavily in staff knowledge and practice development through formal training, in-house PL and coaching cycles. We have to develop this culture of practice improvement. We want to develop data literacy and ensure assessment fidelity. And lastly, maybe most importantly, develop expert educators and interventionists. So we can only be as good as our curriculum and as good as our expertise. Those 2 things are really critical. So I've just put some references and resources here. The references are what I've really referenced or alluded to in my presentation today, and then 5 books that I've found really instrumental for me in my practice. So Learning Disabilities from Identification to Intervention, a Principal's Guide Implementing Response to Intervention, RTI for reading at the secondary level, and then the 2 RTI applications texts. So there's volume 1 and volume 2. So thanks so much for being with me virtually. I hope you have a great conference. And like I said, I really hope to see you at the DSF conference in Perth next year. Thanks so much.